Hi, this is Mark Small. This is December 2nd, 2024. It's still Discourse Now. Cassie Jackson is on here with me. How are you, Cassie?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me again.
Oh, absolutely. This has been a busy day so far, but also uh, I want to talk about what can be happening as all this is moving forward. And I want to talk about the full faith and credit clause of the United States Constitution.
Can
Um,
you explain that real quick? Because
Sure, it's Article 4, Section 1. It says full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. And the Congress may, by general laws, prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved and the effect thereof. In other words, if there's something that's passed in Indiana that affects an Indiana citizen or somebody who was in Indiana and they go to another state, then the effect of whatever is decided here follows that person. So let's look at the example of after Roe versus Wade was
I was
overturned.
just going to bring that up. Yeah.
So a woman wants to go, a woman resides in Indiana still for whatever reason, and discovers she's pregnant and wants to terminate the pregnancy. Indiana is saying she can't do that.
Right.
That's an example of full faith and credit, because if she goes to that other state,
They're
they're going to
supposed to
say
not allow her also because of what Indiana ruled. So then
no,
what,
no,
Mark?
no.
Oh,
They
go ahead.
could extradite her from there. They could,
Oh, they can send her back. Right. Okay.
yeah,
So
or a lawsuit. Let's say that somebody files a lawsuit and sues somebody here on a bogus thing and gets damages for defamation or something. I'm just bringing that one up. And that person goes to another state. They'll hunt them down with that judgment. It doesn't matter, because once you're allowing the structure of one state to impose what the right wing, in this instance, politicians want to do from that state, they're not going to limit themselves anyplace else. The rule of law is silly for them, but it's an example of how they can use the laws that we have on the books and constitutional provisions
so
to further what they want to do.
I want to get this straight. So what you're saying is that really there doesn't all of this talk about like each state needs to be its own, we have our own, that's why we have states, and let the states decide what their laws are. So what is the point of that then if the laws can transfer across? How does that make any sense?
It makes no sense.
Okay.
And it merely is an arbitrary exercise of power by people who are gaining more and more control over the structures. And
Why is that still allowed as the law in, is that just how it's always been, in people and they're going to be using it in a really horrible way now? Or do you
it's
feel
always
like,
been the law. That provision of the Constitution is in Article 4 as the Constitution was written and then ratified and put into effect in 1789. Then the idea is that we are living in a nation where presumably we have rule of law. And it's interesting, in Indiana, for example, we'll enforce the law of another state as long as it's not repugnant to the Indiana Constitution.
right? So that's,
But what becomes repugnant, and especially what if you're dealing with a judiciary in a state that is going to virtually rubber stamp whatever a right wing, agenda
let,
is.
can I give an example of how this, like, so you have a woman, let's say in a blue state, who does want to get a pregnancy termination, and that's allowed in that state. If they're in a different state and that someone were to find out they were pregnant and that was what they're going to do, and that state was a super red state, they could go ahead and prosecute because the
No,
blue state, right, wouldn't have that as a
that's
law. But you're
that's
saying
what,
they wouldn't care.
yeah, they wouldn't care, but also that's what was coming up in the weeks after Roe versus Wade was overturned, because people are looking at, well, wait a second. I think Indiana is one of the first states to get in
Was.
our really our the draconian statute on women's choice, but it's like, how can they reach out further and impose our backward laws on other states? Now,
Right.
also a state.
But they won't do anything about like the progressive things, right? They'll prosecute on their own in Indiana. Sorry, using the abortion example, and we can move on from that if it's.
Well, they're going to try to do this one wherever the right wing MAGA GOP is in power.
Right.
To some degree, it might not matter, especially if Trump gets into office and becomes a dictator.
Right, like that, yeah.
But back in the old days, when we still had rule of law, in the 1960s especially, the states were starting to use federal law for its purpose. They're trying to integrate schools, trying to protect people's voting rights. States had laws that were trying to protect the authority of the states. Then, as things were going right wing, it became really. I'm sorry.
No worries. I think it's so silly that like.
But what happened though in the 60s was and the 70s? So the feds had been securing people's rights. Then Reagan got into office, and
shit the bed.
And there had to be a re-examination of how they were going to protect people's rights. And they were starting to go to states and enact state laws, because if a state Supreme Court or its highest court is the final statement of an individual state's law, and if the state extends greater rights to an individual than the federal law in question, then the state it supersedes whatever the Fed was going to do. A lot of this doesn't.
It's like each state is almost its own little country then. It doesn't make sense how both Donald Trump will be like, well, the states need to decide. But then the idea of a dictatorship is literally full government control.
That's what the states were trying to argue at the time the Constitution was written. Because Patrick Henry, who's governor of Virginia, said he smelt a rat in Philadelphia. He thought there was going to be a complete rewriting of the Constitution. And there was. But Henry was really pushing the idea of slavery as what we have to have for our economy. And, when he said, give me liberty or give me death, he never gave that speech. There's no indication, no contemporaneous evidence that Henry gave any such speech at that time. What had happened, Henry had given a very fiery speech and had insulted the king. And people here were still subjects of the King of England. And Henry came into the House of Burgesses the next day, I think House of Burgesses, and apologized for his words against the king. So the give me liberty, give me death speech was basically a fiction written 35 years later in a biography of Henry.
Wow.
It would run up to the War of 1812, trying to get people real patriotic. Now, the other side of it is about the time that he gave the give me liberty, give me death speech. Henry also wrote a letter to a cousin and said, I'm the last person in the world I would have thought that would own slaves, but they're really convenient. Wow. That's the gist of what he said. So in other words, give me liberty, give them death.
That's right.
And that's kind of, you have to look at those elements of our history in the United States. So, and we got a bad patch ahead of us, it would seem. So write to your representatives wherever they are and tell them you really believe that we are going in a bad way, and encourage President Biden to invoke emergency powers.
Yeah.
And refuse to recognize the election of Donald Trump.
It's the only way to say
he was not qualified because of because of the 14th Amendment, Section 3. He engaged in an insurrection against the United States.
He also is not psychologically fit. I'll talk about that. We're not going to get into it, but there are multiple reasons. And I agree with you. If there's not going to be something done by President Biden, I mean, what is his legacy in pulling us back from a dictatorship? Is he going to be the president that goes down that has refused to do it because of X, Y, and Z? Or is he going to get some fucking balls and do what he needs to do?
There you have it. The Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small. Cassie Jackson has been here. Cassie, have a good day. Good rest of the day.
Thanks, you too, Mark.
Let me find there. There it is. I couldn't find my mouse.